Hello, and welcome to this episode of Mining Matters, a part of the In Dialogue series hosted by the Non-Fuel Minerals and Mining Research Team, led by Dr. Rajesh Chadha at the Center for Social and Economic Progress, New Delhi. We invite experts from India and abroad to discuss how India's mining sector can become a catalyst for economic growth and development, ensuring fair and sustainable mining practices for the environment and affected communities.
Hello, everyone. Welcome to the fifth episode of Mining Matters on the global governance of trade in critical minerals. It is our pleasure to welcome Rohinton Medhora as our speaker today. Rohinton is a professor of practice at McGill University and distinguished fellow and former president at the Center for International Governance Innovation, CIGI, the world's foremost think tank on international governance issues based in Canada. Rohinton is one of the most well-regarded global voices on issues of international economic relations, innovation policy, development economics, and governance. He was the president at CIGI from 2012 to 2022 and served on its former International Board of Governors from 2009 to 2014. Previously, he was the vice president of programs at Canada's International Development Research Centre. Rohinton is chair of the board of the Institute for New Economic Thinking, INET, vice chair at the McLuhan Foundation, board member of Partnership for Economic Policy and the Global Center for Pluralism, and is on the advisory boards of the WTO Chairs Program, UNU Merit, and Global Health Center. He sits on the Commission on Global Economic Transformation, co-chaired by Nobel Economics laureates Michael Spence and Joseph Stiglitz. These are just some of his many, many credentials. We're truly honored to have you with us, Rohinton. Let's begin our conversation today by situating critical minerals in the global governance architecture. So, trade in critical minerals has been governed by the WTO since its inception. While some of these minerals have recently gathered the tag of being critical for net zero transitions, they have been traded under the GATT rules, similar to trade in other materials or finished goods. To begin, I urge you to situate critical minerals in the existing global governance architecture. How is the trade of critical minerals being regulated in the multilateral system today, which means at the WTO? Given the deadlocks and stalemates at the WTO on various issues from the Doha round, how is it impacting the trade in critical minerals? Over to you, Rohinton.
So what you've described, Purvaja, is actually an issue that is endemic to all traded goods and services, which is that we would like to have a global multilateral regime governing their exchange, but the one we have is flawed and in important ways broken. The fact that critical minerals are part of the WTO system should not be surprising. That is exactly where they belong. But let's also keep in mind, since you mentioned the gap, that when it came to the free exchange of goods and services, of necessity, there were important carve-outs from that. Carve-outs for national security, carve-outs for morals and ethics, carve-outs for the environment and for the depletion of natural resources, and so on. So critical minerals are kind of like traded goods, but not entirely, because as you can sense from what they do, they would fall under some of the exceptions. And so that's where the conflicts and the friction has arisen. That's why, in fact, some of us would argue that we need a multilateral governance system for them, because they're complicated features. And I know we'll get to this in our conversation. We have to ask ourselves, if not the WTO, who or what? And I'm sure we'll come to that.
Absolutely, Rohinton. I think it does come as a part of the exceptions, and particularly because the net zero transition journey is so critical today. So let's come to my next question. But before that, we were talking about the net zero transitions. So the targets that we have are with a short timeline within which every country wishes to safeguard the minerals that are critical to their transition journeys. And with the fast pace of technological development, which is aimed at developing cleaner forms of energy, the time we have in hand is even shorter. The multilateral system, as we've said, with the WTO at its core, is not functioning as we need it to, and it's partly due to a defunct dispute settlement mechanism. And this has led many countries to look at bilateral and plurilateral partnerships to secure their critical mineral needs. These partnerships, of course, come with their own set of issues, the threat of unilateral retaliation, trade wars and sanctions. There is sometimes no form of accountability or mechanism in case any disputes arise. And there also come in various geopolitical and regional power plays. It also takes away from the spirit of open, free, and fair trade, which is again the core of the WTO. So the thought arises in this case, can we try to fix what is wrong with our existing system? So what are the bottlenecks in the multilateral system that are encouraging other partnerships, and how can we possibly reform the existing system to remove these barriers? We'd love to hear your thoughts on this.
So I'd say that the fact that the WTO competes with other forms of trade governance is again not new. In fact, the WTO's database on regional trade agreements has a couple of hundred plus of them. This is why it is often called the spaghetti bowl of governance. You have these intertwined regional and plurilateral agreements kind of competing with each other, but also reinforcing each other. And the WTO, in the words of a former DG, is more like the operating system for this whole process to work out. So if critical minerals fall in that same spaghetti bowl, and that we need a sort of separate, distinct, but connected form of governance, that would not be new, and it would not be surprising. The question is, do we need it? And I'd say yes. And second, is the WTO frame, to which unfortunately the answer is also yes. The main one, and you pointed this out in your question, is the demise of the dispute settlement system some years ago. That was in some ways the crown jewel in the WTO. Countries could come and go. They often had dispute settlement systems in their regional trade agreements that they belonged to, but they preferred using the WTO dispute settlement system. So it clearly was getting something right and was seen as a global public good, which it is. But it no longer exists. In critical minerals, there's one salient decision from 2014, I believe it is, where the US won a dispute over China, which was imposing export quotas on critical minerals, and on the grounds of environmental depletion, in fact. And the WTO process found that those grounds were not argued forcefully enough. So there is a history of critical minerals having been adjudicated in the WTO. There's a history of critical minerals having been part of the WTO system. But given that that doesn't exist anymore, we have to think about what the alternatives are. And there's two that I put on the table, and then we can think of others. But ever since the dispute settlement system fell into disrepair, some countries have banded together and created a kind of, I wouldn't call it informal, but certainly an unofficial alternate. I had to write, because that's how it's called, MPIA, but the full is the multi-party interim appeal arbitration arrangement. I don't believe India belongs to that. I don't believe the US does, China does, the European Union does, but it is an alternative. And so if we want to get serious about critical minerals, the key countries could join the MPIA. The other one, and this is a bit of a mystery to me, is for a while there was talk about a plurilateral agreement around the environmental goods agreement. And that too has kind of faded away, but that would have been the other venue for critical minerals to be covered. Given that those two venues perhaps are not available, although the MPIA still is, it behooves us to think about what those other alternatives might be.
Oh, absolutely, Rohinton. I think, I have done some work on trying to understand the MPIA, And things, I mean, it's voluntary. It's for countries to get onto if they wish. And the United States is, of course, looking at it as something they would not like to do. They want to reform the WTO's dispute settlement system. They don't want the appellate body back, which is, I will come to that in my next question. But that's the whole attempt of this this discussion, trying to see if we can look for interim arrangements or something that will work while we try to see how we can fix the WTO mechanisms. So coming to the dispute settlement, as I was saying, the dispute settlement is at a stalemate at the moment because of the defunct appellate body. So just for our listeners, I'm just putting it in a little bit of context. So when a trade dispute arises at the WTO, the dispute settlement body constitutes a panel that will hear the case and submit its reports. The parties to the dispute then have the option of accepting and implementing the panel's report and ending the dispute then and there, or filing an appeal. This process is always long and tardy. And once the appeal is filed, the constituted appellate body then reviews the case and gives its recommendations. And since the appellate body is currently defunct, any party who the panel has ruled against can file an appeal to avoid the punitive measures that they dictate. And sometimes they do it just to buy some time. And this loophole at the moment has seriously undermined the effectiveness of the WTO's dispute settlement system. So many cases that have gone into appeal are just stuck in appeal for years together, till either we reform the WTO's dispute settlement mechanism and reinstate an appellate body, or we do away with appeals completely. There have been disputes, as you mentioned, on issues like critical minerals and rare earths that have come to the dispute settlement mechanism, and some have taken a long time to resolve. I mean, your example was from 2014, and there are some more that have come up since. So how can these delays caused by a defunct dispute settlement system impact our global race, or our, the urgency with which each country wants to acquire critical minerals for its own use, but also use it for, net zero transition journeys of your own country as well as the rest of the world?
So that's the point. Even when the dispute settlement system was functional, it was slow, or as of necessity, rigorous judicial processes are. The 2014 decision was actually the result of a complaint filed in 2012 by the US. So that was a snappy 2-year process. And as you say, we may not have that much time, especially with appeals into the void, as it's now come to be called. So I'd say the kinds of issues that we face with critical minerals and rare earths are not necessarily a function of the fact that the dispute settlement system isn't working anymore. They were issues even when the dispute settlement system was working. And what they highlight is a kind of fundamental flaw in global governance, which is everyone wants to play by the rules when things are normal. But when things are not normal, which is when you need the rules the most, by the way, is when, especially large countries, choose to go their own way. We saw this with the COVID vaccine situation and with PPGs, where countries imposed restrictions on the export of personal protective equipment and on vaccines at the height of the COVID crisis, because they needed that material to safeguard their own citizens' interests. That's a completely understandable position for a sovereign country to take. But it runs up against your multilateral commitments. And if everyone does it, well, then there's no multilateral left anymore. So critical minerals fall in that category where we don't have time. They are precious. They are, as the phrase says, critical. And in that kind of situation, I don't know if there's any sensible multilateral regime that's going to function. I think in that case, we have to accept that in some cases, there's going to be geopolitics and geoeconomics at play, that there's going to be a might is right. And, he who holds the material controls the trade kind of situation. And what we have to do is make sure that people understand what their common interest might be in this. Now, with critical minerals, the common interest is, as you said, the net zero transition. If 120 countries make the transition but 10 don't, then 130 countries have not made the transition because of the spillover effects of climate change. If we start from that, then I think you say the next thing we want is efficiency in decision making. Inclusion, yes, but also efficiency. Those two have to be balanced. And in things like the WTO, it's often the case that the inclusion sort of dominates the efficiency, hence those sort of long delays in dispute settlement and in negotiation broadly. And so this is an instance where we might want to think about a plurilateral approach, an approach where a few countries that matter the most to this trade come together and create an organization. We might want to think in terms of a G20-led initiative, because the G20, again, is one of those things that balances inclusion with efficiency. Your own organization has, I think, made a very sensible proposal last year to create a governance mechanism that is multi-country but not multilateral on this. But we have to be thinking about those kinds of ways forward.
Absolutely, Rohinton. I think, let's come to the G20 suggestion in my next question. But let's talk about, the global governance mechanism that we're thinking through. Maybe something on the lines of what OPEC did for oil. Can we think of creating something like that for critical minerals, which will support the system till the stalemate at the WTO gets resolved? So, various things that come to mind. This mechanism could in some ways be a repository of information on critical minerals. And this is, they can ensure better data availability and transparency on which country holds how many reserves and who can, export which minerals to whom. And this is something that scholars in this field have indicated is an important need in today's time. So if a system like this can be thought through, can a system like this work? If it does, how could it look? Which countries could lead its formation? And how will it ensure accountability, which is one thing that we look to the multilateral system for, and which plurilaterals and regionals don't really ensure accountability in case of any dispute or in case of any issue that comes up during the trade. So I'd love to hear your thoughts on this.
The OPEC analogy is an interesting one. OPEC was a producer's cartel. And I think with critical minerals, we want to learn some of the lessons from OPEC and maybe do better than OPEC. And for the reasons that we know, that critical minerals have a supply side, but also demand side, and also a global side, which is to say, the transition to net zero. I would think we want this institution to be more inclusive than what OPEC was. OPEC was an imperfect producers cartel. Some producers didn't belong. By the way, you said accountability. There was rampant, and there is rampant cheating in OPEC quotas that happens, where countries opt out of their quotas with no apparent sanction. So the OPEC model isn't quite the one I think about. I think about a model that contains both producer and consumer countries. I would think about a model that also has some version of science or engineering community so that you have a tripartite model. And the example that I think of more when it comes to these things is something like the International Energy Agency. It is more inclusive. It does a lot more of analysis and policy work than OPEC does on behalf of all of its members. Its forecasts are often seen to be credible and rigorous. And tacking onto an IEA type of model, some function of dispute settlement, perhaps some accountability might be the way forward. Finally, IEA, OPEC, all of these things were created at a time when the G20 did not exist. The G20 now does exist. And so although I know that the G20 has a lot on its plate and in fact has been drifting the past few years after a few initial successes in its early life, I'd argue that the G20 is the right place for something like this to be, if not housed, certainly launched and blessed. If you have the weight of the G20 behind this kind of endeavor, then creating a separate, independent, multi-country secretariat organization that does the technical work, that actually creates the space where these issues can be talked through, is the way to go. So I think there's something there to be thought through. Final point, yes to all of that. I'm optimistic. On the other hand, we can't ignore the current geopolitics, which is the rift between US and China. Both are important players on the supply and demand side of critical minerals. They seem to be going out of their way to not see eye to eye on almost every major issue. It would be nice if this is the issue on which they came together. I wouldn't bet my house on it, but I think it's worth a shot because without these and without the technology that we need to recycle critical materials and use less of them and so on, and in fact extract them in more clean ways and transport them better, we're not going to reach net zero tolerance.
Absolutely. I think, Rohinton, the G20 is your favorite topic and mine. We both have studied this for a while. And I think issues as crucial as critical minerals and the access every country needs would be something the G20 has started to look at in the last few years. The energy ministers' meetings have had discussions on critical minerals, though very preliminary ones. The climate-related discussions, transition-related discussions are, of course, a part of the G20's agenda. So you mentioned this a little bit at initially, but let's come to that. So, I think we need to see how the G20's effectiveness as a consensus-building forum can be leveraged for discussing critical minerals at a much larger scale than what is happening at the moment. And like you said, our team here at CSEP, led by Dr. Chadha, last year for the G20 under India's presidency, suggested a G20 Critical Mineral Security Partnership, or MSP, which is based on the lines of the US-led Mineral Security Partnership. So how do you think a mechanism like this, could this be the global governance mechanism that we've been trying to think through? And how would this work?
It could, and I hope that when you put this on air, that you have a link to that proposal and paper, because I think it's a tight proposal. I haven't thought through its detail in every way, but I do think the broad principle of saying that a few main players need to come together and discuss, as I recall, broad trends in production and consumption, forecasting, some version of dispute resolution, and some version of technology governance is what's needed here. There are some fundamental issues, by the way, on this, which I don't know if any organization can overcome. The main one being that critical minerals are still rare. They're concentrated in a few countries, and we're never going to get over the issue that I outlined previously, which is countries are going to be possessive of them and use them strategically and geopolitically because they are leverage. I don't know that any organizational function is going to get us to a point where that doesn't happen. What we can do is minimize it. What we can do is minimize the adverse consequences, especially for third countries. We have to create the platform for all of this to begin, and I think that's what your proposal does.
Absolutely. I think, that will be a great way for these discussions to, come to, forums like the G20, where it's representative of so many countries, and another attempt at, moving from plurilaterals to, countries that are representative of the world. So let's come to a little bit of an evaluation of the existing mechanisms. So for critical minerals, they're a crucial component of the US-led regional efforts. Some of these are, of course, attempts to decouple existing supply chains away from China. But the Indo Pacific Economic Forum, IPEF for that matter, or the Mineral Security Partnership that we spoke about. So the US is trying such efforts within the Indo-Pacific region as well. There is scope for cooperation between regional groupings like the ASEAN and the Quad on critical minerals. Likewise, there are trilateral cooperation agreements that are being explored at the moment with like-minded countries in an attempt to secure, again, their supply of critical minerals and move away from China. And you mentioned earlier that the US and China don't seem to be on the same page, and they won't be because they're both front runners in this space. So, our team at CSEP has proposed some such partnerships as well. So how would you evaluate the effectiveness of some of these existing mechanisms? And do you feel that with the criticism that multilateralism is currently facing, are these bilateral and plurilateral partnerships here to stay for now? And do their benefits overrule their shortcomings? And I've listed their shortcomings, unilateral retaliation, regional power plays, and things that are a lot more evident in the plurilateral and regional space rather than at multilateral forums. So your thoughts on that, please?
No, that may well be the only option that's left. I don't think there's any alternative to the kind of experimentation and ad hocism that we're seeing at the regional and local level. I also think that it is entirely possible that you will find two families of governance. You will find that the China and China orbit gravitates around one form of governance and the US and US orbit gravitates around the other. What that creates is a great game in third-party states, particularly in Latin America and in sub-Saharan Africa, where a lot of these materials are located. I haven't sort of done the geo mapping, perhaps you have, to ask myself if there was a US block and a China block, which one has the edge on these minerals? And there's also sort of unknown deposits, which we have to talk through. But it seems to me that this is where we're headed. In an ideal world, we would have the US and China blocks and the two main countries in the same tent. That's unlikely to happen. In its absence, what we will see is free-ish trade within the blocks. But even here, we have to be sort of careful. I think when something is rare enough and important enough and strategic enough, even among friends, there's going to be some dispute, some retaliation, and some xenophobia, as it were. So I don't think regional blocks or political blocks will resolve the issue entirely. The issue is endemic to the nature of these things, and these things are the way they are. There is not going to be a clean governance system for them for some time to come. Perhaps technological change somewhere might make some of them redundant or have us use less of them. We might learn to recycle the ones we have better. We might just learn to live more green. But short of that, I'm not especially optimistic that a multilateral system exists that can simply take over this situation and improve it.
Absolutely, Rohinton. I think your suggestion about somebody doing the mapping of the two blocks and what each country can bring in to the game is very interesting and something for scholars to think about. And I think this has been a great discussion. And before we close, Rohinton, do you have any more parting thoughts on this topic? And like your example, maybe some more further ideas for our scholars to pursue research on? And maybe we can have a follow-up conversation with you after we've worked on this a little more.
My sense is that when there's a gap in global governance, it always seems that there's lots of opportunities and there's lots of reasons why things are the way they are. And so I don't think we should be deterred from this. At the end of the day, I would hope that countries see their common interest in this. And in fact, I'm reminded of the pre-OPEC era, where we thought oil was then the critical mineral. In some ways, it still is, but and up emerged a producers' cartel of countries that really didn't give us a lot of confidence. And yet, through some form of cooperation and understanding, prices have been more or less systematized. I wouldn't call them stabilized, but systematized. Even with the cheating, there is a system that's broadly functional. And although oil, again, is distributed in ways that are geopolitically inconvenient, the world did not come to an end. And I would hope that we find a similar way forward with critical minerals. In some ways, the context is better because at least we have a G20, we have other examples like OPEC and IEA that we can learn from and build from. And at the end of the day, I hope we understand that the issue here isn't critical minerals, it's our collective well-being and the sustainability.
Absolutely, Rohinton. And on that optimistic note, thank you so much for taking the time to talk to us in this episode of Mining Matters. And we hope to host you again for yet another discussion soon. I'm sure our viewers and listeners will have a lot of food for thought from your insights. I thank you to all of us, all of those listening to us intently, and I hope you will all join us for the next episode of Mining Matters. Have a good day. Thank you.